All right, welcome everyone. Hope everyone enjoyed the claymation introduction there. My name is Chris Eichman, and I'm here with Ryan Schellenberg. Before we begin and I introduce him, I want to say be sure to follow and subscribe to Herbs and Pullets. We're on all your favorite social media, very easy to get, find us and keep up to date. We got all sorts of cool stuff on social media, so be sure to follow us to keep up with the interviews or other sorts of information about Christianity, Greco-Roman antiquity. Um, but I'm here today with Ryan Schellenberg. Ryan is Associate Professor of the New Testament at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio. Um, and I'm here to talk with him today about his new book, Abject Joy. I don't know if my screen is mirrored. Hopefully it shows. Oh, yep, there we go. I got my copy here. Um, and when I was reading the book, I was asked to do a book review of it for the journal Bible and Critical Theory. And I found a very exciting book. And I thought it'd be something I wanted to publicize and make sure it got a good wide readership. So uh, maybe if I could just begin, Ryan, this is your second book. It's an award-winning book, won the Frank W. Beer Award for the Canadian Society of Biblical Studies just a couple months ago. But maybe just to sort of, how would you summarize the argument of this book, right? What is Abject Joy? What's it about? It's about Paul, but what exactly is it doing in this book?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the invitation to be part of this conversation. I think if insofar as the book could be said to have a single argument, it is an argument about what joy means in Paul's letter to the Philippians. Philippians is quite famously, it's often referred to as the letter of joy. And yet Paul writes it in the context of prison, which provokes various kinds of reflections from scholars. For the most part, that's been taken um, well, there are what you might call pious readings of Philippians
Hmm.
that make a fairly simple equation between Paul's Christian faith and his ability to experience joy in circumstances of hardship. These tend to be more devotional kinds of explanations of Paul's joy in Philippians. There are also Stoic readings of Philippians that look at Paul's at the philosophical context and see in Paul a kind of see Paul essentially using Stoic tropes to emphasize his capacity to withstand hardship, and have that be the dominant explanation for joy in Philippians. My argument is that joy in Philippians is neither just this kind of pious joy, nor is it really a Stoic ability to withstand hardship,
Hmm.
but that it emerges actually from Paul's imprisoned body, and from the relationships that he has with those around him. Sometimes that joy takes the form of ecstasy, uh, experiences of the Holy Spirit. Sometimes it takes the form of remembering those Philippians who care for him even in his hardship. And so to try to get at this more embodied experience of joy, joy that isn't just an idea or a devotional trope, I work with other prisoners who talk about joy in prison context, including some modern prisoners who talk about joy in prison
Yeah.
contexts.
Oh, go ahead. No, no, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Oh, well, and I was going to say maybe this is a good time to interrupt, because I was going to go on and say, so that would be, if the book has a single argument.
Hmm.
But I also try to use Paul's experience of imprisonment, um, and specifically the fact that, Paul is a precarious body in a
Yeah.
precarious social situation as a lever to try to push some things that have got stuck in Pauline scholarship. And so there's the central argument around Paul's joy and what that means in Philippians, but then that also becomes a way to try to move some other things in Pauline scholarship, that I think are often stuck.
Yeah, it seems like kind of those two readings of Philippians that you're pushing back against, one that situates them within a kind of a certain type of Christian theological tradition,
Sure.
another one associating it with a certain type of philosophical tradition that, um, in a lot of what you're saying, and I think this is a lot of what I find exciting about the book, is you're pushing back against sort of that reading of Paul as a strong figure, right? I think we've got
Hmm.
certain shared intellectual influences in that regard, why that's appealing to us.
Hmm.
But it's something that, what does it mean to read Paul as someone who, for all of his boasting, may not be doing it ironically when he's doing that, when he's talking about pain, when he's talking about all these sort of not unpleasant experiences, is coming from a place of, well, maybe his life is at times precarious, miserable in many ways. But what is he doing with that, right? How is he experiencing joy while being in this state of abjection as well? And I think that's something I found really exciting about the book, kind of pushing in those different directions there. Um, Go ahead. Yeah,
Yeah,
did you want?
yeah, and so that's where, again, reading modern literature and ethnography from prison contexts
Mhm.
um, gave me something I didn't find anywhere else, I think, which was, people who are living and breathing in situations of precarity. And in that context, talk about finding ways to experience joy. And they don't describe that in Stoic terms, at least not very often. And they don't describe it as something simple, but something they're striving for, something they're working for, not a kind of simple triumphalistic experience, which is how Paul is often read. So I'm trying to get at that textured understanding of what joy in prison might be about.
Yeah, I think this transitions well into one of the questions that I had, which is, I think what I really appreciate not just about this book, but your first book about rhetoric in what Corinthians as well, is that you do this really interesting kind of juxtaposition or comparative work between these sort of ancient writers, Paul in both cases, and also kind of much more modern writers, or you know often not writers in the sense of academics, but kind of people who are often life on the ground, their experience of things. And um, I find these really compelling how you do that, right? You're not sticking only with examples from antiquity, but you're using examples from modernity as well. But you do it in a way that I think you seem to pretty successfully avoid anachronism in the process when you are talking about sort of the experience of prisons in America or many other places, right? Um, and maybe would you just mind elaborating on kind of how you go about doing that? Because it seems to me that you're acutely aware of kind of the differences between now and then, but you're also finding it kind of this area for really fruitful conversation, fruitful points of comparison that we might not find if we were limiting our scope to or comparanda to like papyri or epistles from antiquity or anything like that, right? So,
Hmm.
how do you kind of approach this question of um, what comparative work between antiquity and modernity in a way that I think pretty successfully avoids that issue of anachronism? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, I mean, for me, that comparative work is essential to fueling my historiographical imagination, if I can
Mm,
put it that way. Largely because, well, I would say one of the weaknesses of conventional biblical studies is that it tends to work at the level of abstraction. It's about words and ideas. And words and ideas are fine, but they also don't constitute the whole of the whole of life and the whole of the historical subject matter that we want to get at. So as a way of and most of our sources consist, of course, of words.
mhm,
And even more specifically, most of our sources consist of words from people for whom playing with words, manipulating words, was a important vocation, or at least a mode of expression. That is, we're working with the most of our sources are the works of the literary elite.
yeah.
Um, but most people were not the literary elite. So how do we frame our imagination in a way that doesn't allow those abstractions to dominate our understanding of ancient cultures?
Mhm,
This is why I find comparative ethnography such a useful way to try to get at some of those questions. When it comes to the problem of anachronism, one of the insights that has guided me is John Kloppenberg talks about comparison as generating questions, not generating answers.
mm,
So for me, reading in this case prison literature from other contexts helps to open up a set of questions and possibilities that allow allow us to ask new questions of these ancient texts. It doesn't tell
mhm.
us what the answers to those questions will be, although it may, nudge us in particular directions. In the end, it's still the historical material um, that needs to answer the historical questions. But it opens up our imaginations in ways that I think are really useful.
Yeah, it sounds like it kind of what puts questions forward or raises questions, things that we thought might be obvious if we're only reading certain biblical texts or ancient literature. Hey, well, what exactly is going on here? I like that a lot.
Uh-huh. I think maybe one other thing I'd say, to me, historiography is principally the work of a disciplined imagination. It always
Mm,
involves imagination. So either you can fill, the things that your sources don't explicitly say, you have to fill in the gaps one way or another. And you can either fill that out in a naive way based upon your own intuitions, which will inevitably be anachronistic,
mhm.
or you can try to use comparative methodologies to discipline your imagination in ways that, again, it's not positivistic. You can't get at certainty, but you can hopefully get at something better than naivety in that way.
Yeah, yeah, it's true because a lot of what we're doing kind of is a sort of like historical fiction in some ways, right? We're filling in a lot of these gaps, and that comparative work can at least make us be clear what we're drawing upon as opposed to that sort of intuitive sense. That's
Uh-huh.
helpful.
Hmm.
Um, Another huge thing about the book that I think is worth foregrounding is that role of affect and emotion theory throughout it, right? I think this is something that into humanities broadly, I think the past decade or so, those have been really big catchwords in the right, like especially affect and emotion theory. And they're starting to make kind of inroads in biblical studies. I think, yeah, to various extents. I think one thing I really well, what? Maybe I could just ask, how did you get into that? I don't recall that being a huge part of your first book. Um, so this is something that you've come to, is my impression here. But how did you arrive at this as something that would be helpful? How did you? What interested you in the first place with this? Because I think it's something that can be really dense, really scary. I think Deleuze is someone that is not always pleasant to read, for instance, and yet you do it quite successfully in a way that I think it's easy for the reader to see, like, oh, this is actually a really helpful way of understanding what's going on in Philippians. So, what brought affect and emotion theory to interest for you? Excuse me, to
Yeah.
you, would be kind of the question I have here.
Yeah, good question. And I think I might start, but well, I came upon it in some ways accidentally. I had a conceptual problem, which is, how do I make sense of joy historically?
Mm,
How do I think about joy again in a way that is something other than my own naive intuitions around what joy must mean?
mhm,
And I went searching for resources to help me. Um, and here, I mean, I think you're right. Affect theory, in particular, has can look quite dense from the outside and intimidating.
mhm,
And I'll confess that my when it comes to affect theory specifically, my knowledge is not non-existent, but also I would not confidently write in engagement with most of the key figures in what has become affect theory. So I
mhm,
engage much less with what tends to be known as affect theory than with the history of emotions.
mm,
Again, this is not an attempt to slight the work that gets done under the rubric of affect theory, but to say this is the domain that I found most, or the field of scholarship I found most useful.
mhm,
Um, and so I came upon work by people like Robert Castor, people like Angelos Chaniotis, who were working on what emotion is about in the ancient world. The recognition that emotion is not timeless, um, emotion is not culturally neutral, but in fact, it's an aspect of social life. And if it's an aspect of social life, it's a field for cultural history, and for historians, including historians of the New Testament, in my case, to use ordinary historical tools to tackle. Now, there's a bunch of other things that we also need to tackle then in relation to what emotion is and how we would describe that.
mhm,
But that's the short answer of how I got there. Is
yeah,
I wanted to know, how do I make sense of joy? Um, where else does joy show up in the ancient world? What does it mean? What are the cultural codes surrounding it?
mhm,
I'm less invested because of that in in biological questions around what joy might be, although not, I don't think those are irrelevant, but less invested in those and more invested in the cultural questions around
Mhm.
how joy is expressed and cultivated in different contexts.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's yeah, the history of emotions stuff would seem to be certainly a fruitful area of conversation there for precisely what you're doing with this, right? So my understanding is then sort of Paul was kind of that initial point of question of what on earth is going on here in Philippians, and then um, what in your searching, it seems like this is kind of history of emotions and affect are kind of those helpful areas that you had found for making sense of what's going on in Philippians. Is that a fair characterization there?
Yeah, I think so. I
Yeah,
think so.
very cool. Um, One thing that's also important in your book is there's a lot of work going on. It's a book about Philippians, but there's a kind of a lot of implicit work and often explicit work going on with Acts as well.
Hmm.
That uh, often you're going out of your way to avoid what kind of importing Acts narrative onto Philippians, right? Because Acts has its own particular portrait of Paul, and you're quite explicit that, well, I'm trying to not just sort of take that and insert that to make sense of Philippians, right? Or maybe it's vice versa, insert Philippians into Acts to make sense of it there. Um, why is that important to you? Is what methodologically is at stake for you, or even in terms of the meaning of the epistles? Does this figure into kind of what you were saying at the beginning about kind of those pious readings of Philippians, or kind of other kinds of traditions that you're pushing back against? But what's at stake at you for you in terms of Acts in
Yeah.
this case?
No, that's a good question. I think that it's a shrewd question that, yes, I say I'm trying to read Philippians and I want to set Acts off to the side, but I keep coming back to Acts.
Hmm.
And that is in fact intentional. That's self-conscious. I think, it's very common for critical Pauline scholars to say, I'm going to construct my reading of whatever text or my understanding of whatever aspect of Paul's life on the basis of the epistles alone.
Hmm.
I don't think that those same scholars are always aware of how substantially Acts has shaped the history of interpretation that they're engaging with, and whether consciously or not, their own imaginations with
Hmm.
regard to reading Paul. Um, I think it reaches further than we're always aware of, and so in some ways, um, yeah, we ignoring it is not an adequate solution. We actually have to intentionally counteract the influence of Acts, um, in order to produce a reading of the epistles that is not shaped by Acts. And so this is why I go out of my way to say, Acts pushes us in this direction, and yet look at how Philippians runs against that grain
Right.
in various kinds of ways. Um, it's an intentional overcorrection in some ways, uh, to push against what's going on in Acts. Now, that Acts is very one of the reasons that's difficult is because I think Acts is actually engaging with the Pauline letters, um,
I think,
and
or that
because
JBL article, if I remember correctly, right? I can't remember the title of it. But didn't you do that, or am I
yeah,
misremembering?
the first Pauline chronologist, I call it.
Yes, yeah.
Um,
It's worth
right,
checking out for those of you at JBL. I can't remember what year, what volume it is, but
neither can
first volume
I.
chronologist. It's worth, yeah. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Right, so I think that that Acts is actually engaging with Paul's letters, and for that reason, it's it gives what you could call in retrospect kind of plausible misreadings. That is,
Mm,
they're engaged enough with the material in the letters that it sounds right if you are inclined to take Acts at face value, but on further analysis, some of that correspondence evaporates. So a good example of that is the motif of Paul on trial. The word apologia, defense, that shows up in Philippians very commonly gets read as though it's a reference to a legal defense,
mhm.
because in the book of Acts, Paul is often on trial. He gives his defense. That defense is often referred to as an apologia. And I think that Philippians has influenced Acts, and then Acts has influenced interpretations of Philippians, in ways that are difficult to untangle.
Yeah, that kind of the mixing up of all of that intertangling, that's I guess to me that strikes me as kind of the exciting some of the exciting stuff about Pauline biography right now, right? Just kind of how
Hmm.
to identify how this has happened up, how Acts has habituated us into reading Paul's letters in particular ways. And I think that's something you pretty consistently go back to in exciting ways throughout the book, I find, and very productive as well. Yeah, it also kind of what you're saying reminds me of what you were saying earlier about comparative work too, right? Like if all we're doing is just filling in with our own imagination, it's gonna be rife with anachronism, right? And if all we're doing is assuming that, oh, what Paul says here is corresponds exactly to what's happening in this or that chapter of Acts, well, it's not exactly critical historiography at all. It's just sort of, um, you know, maybe historiographic apologetics, but often it is precisely that it's an apologetics of some sort of just showing that these are kind of a single continuous narrative. So
Hmm.
that strikes me as something that's pretty important to your project as well as um, not just resorting to fanciful imagination, but um, being aware of those discrepancies between now and then as well.
Yeah, and I think methodologically, setting Acts aside is the only coherent way to read Paul's letters.
Hmm.
Um, and then if one reads Paul's letters with but self-consciously avoiding the influence of Acts on your reading, and then you go back to Acts and you decide that actually in the end Acts is, Acts does correspond to what you find in the Pauline letters, well then fine.
Hmm.
Um, but to allow Acts to influence the discussion before you've done a thorough reading of Paul's letters, I think, is to forfeit the task of reading the primary documents on their own terms as a historian.
Yeah, it's in the same way that I think where I mean you read what other kind of examples from ancient texts where we would not afford them that same privilege, right? We can kind of notice perhaps discrepancies between, let's say, the account of the Third Servile War with Spartacus. The different sources, we would not simply assume them to be the same, but we draw perhaps trace those lines of influence, notice those discrepancies, and it seems that there's yet to be that full accounting with Paul about where those discrepancies between our main narrative source, namely Acts, is and the actual primary sources that are produced by Paul or those who are within his vicinity anyway, right?
Uh-huh. Well, and yes, and part of the problem there is our own unwillingness not to know certain things about, for
Mm,
example, Paul's chronology. If
mm,
at the end of the day you need a chart that spells out the chronology of Paul's life, well then it's true you have no option but to make recourse to Acts. You
mhm.
can attempt an epistolary chronology and it will always be partial and somewhat hypothetical. Um, and so part of the task, I think, of pushing Acts out of the conversation around Paul's biography and into the conversation around Paul's reception, uh, is being willing to live with more uncertainty and more with more not knowledge,
Yeah.
non-knowledge than we tend to ordinarily live with.
Yeah, it's true because like I feel like even from a young age when we're taught like history, I feel like certainty is that goal that we're always searching for, and like messing with that a little bit kind of goes against those tendencies that we're used to, whether we're taught at certain points and we get more or less comfortable with. But that goal, I think, we tend to think of certainty as the ultimate goal of most of our scholarship, whether it's historiography or theoretical work. And you're right, kind of admitting that the sources don't tell us everything we might well want to know. Um, it's tough to admit at times, but it seems to be essential, especially given the database that we have of the Pauline corpus.
Yeah,
Um,
I'd call that a mark of mature historiography, is the recognition of where the limits of our knowledge are, and the
yeah,
refusal to meaninglessly speculate into that void.
absolutely. No, I appreciate it a lot. Um, Maybe if I could go to one question I actually don't have on, didn't mention before, and I don't think Mark knows, is I was wondering if I could just ask you, um, where did your interest in ancient or prisons come from? This seems to have been a project you've been working on for a while. I think one of the chapters is a revised version of something you published in the Journal for Theological Studies a handful of years ago. I can't remember when that was.
Mhm.
ancient prisons are an interest of my own, so that I'm not stalking Ryan, his stuff here. Um, but what was your point of entry or interest into this topic?
Yeah.
What's how did you get into this? Is maybe the question here.
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, well, I from my from my first book, which is a revision of my dissertation, I had interest in Paul's what I would call Paul's social location, where we
Hmm.
place him in the ancient world, and already a hunch that scholars were accustomed to placing him as a person of more social power and clout than made sense of some of the biographical data we have in his letters. Um, and so then, frankly, my first teaching assignment when I landed at Fresno Pacific University, where I had my first teaching job, was to teach a course on Paul's prison letters.
Oh wow.
And so I was already inclined to approach the problem of teaching these letters. Philippians and Philemon were the letters that were the subject of the course. Taking prison seriously as the context that they came, that these letters emerged from. And when I tried to find good scholarly material on this topic, I found myself largely coming up blank. That is, I didn't find a lot of material that took prison seriously, and
Hmm.
particularly took there were a few books. I think of Craig Wansink's
Yeah.
book Chained in Christ, which actually has a fairly thorough and substantive description of prison in the ancient world. It, there are things missing, but there's a lot there of value. Um, but then proceeds to describe Paul playing with prison almost like it's a rhetorical trope.
Mm,
So an idea to bounce around rather than the embodied context from which Paul writes the letter.
sure.
So it was really a dissatisfaction with what I could find in that context that made me think I need to do more work on this particular topic.
That's kind of funny, just sort of the happenstance of like I'm
Hmm.
assuming it's the class that had already existed and you were assigned. Is that correct?
Exactly. That's right. I was just assigned that
No,
class.
that's kind of hilarious. That's what it was. No, it absolutely makes sense though. I think you know one thing in my own experience is precisely that there has been very little work um, on prisons. I think I'd say I'm not biased here, but I would say I think the one to search out now, not least because it's the most recent, up to date, and kind of engaging with a wide corpus of literature. But I think Craig Wansink's book was, I think, before yours, the one that I would say most satisfactorily for me engaged kind of the primary sources and didn't kind of shoehorn it into Acts narrative. But there's been this kind of lack of interest in, I'd say, especially biblical studies and the questions of prison. But even in Greco-Roman antiquity, um, you know, I'd say in the 90s there was a little bit of an interest, but it didn't last too long. Um, and yet we kind of find, Foucault's work on the birth of the prison, or excuse me, Discipline and Punish, um,
Yeah.
among kind of other kind of what prison's been kind of this widespread point of interest in the academy, right? Kind of the prison industrial complex, people thinking about racialization. So I'm just wondering kind of what your take on all this is. Like, if prisons have been this sort of hot topic in research in other fields, do you have any thoughts on why biblical studies or even antiquity classicists have been kind of reticent to engage it too thoroughly? It tends to mostly be that level of description rather than any sort of major analysis is kind of my experience of it anyway, but maybe your take would be different.
Yeah. Well, let me borrow an answer
Okay.
from Matthew Larson, who's doing, as
Right.
you
Yeah, it's
surely
true.
know, um, really groundbreaking work in the study of ancient prisons as they relate to early Christianity, but also more generally. Um, his his conviction, which I think is certainly a good part of the answer, is that between Foucault, who described the prison as being born essentially in
Mhm.
the 18th century, a product of European modernity, um, and then Theodore Mommsen, who, the great classicist scholar of Roman legal history, who just, his discussion of prison consigns prison to a pre-trial holding ground and essentially says that that prison was not an important part of the Roman world beyond that very narrow use. And so I think that Mommsen's kind of dictum around prison ends up defining the discussion in classical studies for a fairly long period of time. Although there has been then in the last 20, 30 years some significant ferment around that and a recognition that prison
Yeah.
shows up more often. Now, part of that is because the field of Roman legal studies has changed significantly from the kind of positivist approach you see in Mommsen to a more cultural studies kind of approach. And as law becomes a domain for cultural history rather than just legal history, you see lots of new questions being generated around prison. So Julia Hillner's book on the prison in late antiquity would be an excellent example of that. And Matthew Larson's work as well is an example.
I'm trying to
An
remember.
example
Matthew
of
works
that.
on, is it late antiquity as well? I'm trying to remember the exact period. I think he's got like 2 books he's working on. I'm trying to remember what they are.
Yeah, there are 2 books currently in process. One with Mart Lettany that's called Ancient Mediterranean Incarceration, which is a broad, chronologically and geographically broad discussion.
Uh-huh.
And then he's also working on a book on early Christians and incarceration.
Okay.
I don't know the timelines of either of those books, but I look forward to seeing
Yeah.
each of them. He's engaging the archaeological evidence in ways that I was not able to. I really just don't have the expertise to do in my own work.
Yeah, I remember talking with him at, I think, SVL once, and yeah, just sort of it's pretty fascinating looking at sort of, yeah, I feel like the archaeological record was something that we're not really accustomed to doing. I think kind of one thing you had mentioned early in the conversation was how we're very prone to look at words and that level of abstraction in a way that I think will be a very valuable conversation partner for us when he publishes these books there. So
Yes, absolutely.
yeah. Yeah, so it's just I don't know. I think you're right. So kind of Momsen's influence absolutely makes sense why that would kind of limit the conversation um, with that. Um, it seems like that's changing a bit as you mentioned. Would you attribute that to anything in particular in your mind? Do you think that would be sort of just sort of the broader cultural questions about the prison in I'd say especially North American, but often specifically U.S. context? Like, what do you think it's becoming more of an interest, not just well for you, but also for others? Do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that historiography is always in conversation with the present as well as the past, and so I think
Hmm.
the current emphasis on making sense of mass incarceration and criminalization in the American context is part of what's pushing the conversation, both in classical studies and in the New Testament. And to be fully forthcoming, I had read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow not long before I began work on this project. That is, there are
Sure.
things about the American context on my mind throughout this as well. And so for me, asking questions about prison in the ancient world is also a way of thinking through prison in our contemporary context.
Yeah. So one thing I just want to say, I want to actually follow up on that point. I just want to note to viewers, you're more than welcome if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Ryan here. Feel free to submit them through whatever social media you're watching this on. I'll be happy to ask them if anything comes to mind. But on that note, I guess I'm curious. I know you presently teach at a seminary in the States, and I've taught at a seminary here in Toronto. And um, prison ministry, especially prison chaplains, are kind of, I've had numerous students who might be getting a master's of divinity in this. And um, maybe if I could just kind of broadly ask you a question, do you see your book offering anything useful, or what, maybe perhaps what do you see your book offering people who might be thinking about pursuing kind of what any type of prison ministry, or people who might have loved ones who are in prison, in terms of that contemporary context that you're kind of alluding to engaging that context in some sense, but
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
you see any particular points where this may be useful or perhaps the limits even of what you're doing, right? You're certainly not writing about modernity here, but modernity comes up quite a bit in your book. So does that question kind of make sense? So um, how might this book be useful to people thinking about prisons in contemporary context? Would be maybe another way of phrasing the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. Um, and let me start by saying the book is not it's not written in that register. That is, it's
Right.
not written addressing those questions explicitly. But it is written with those questions in mind, and I would hope that it can be taken up fruitfully um, by people who are working in that space. It was one of the first book reviews to appear was actually in the Christian Century,
Oh, really?
which is a major Protestant magazine for pastors and lay people, and was written by a prison chaplain
Mm,
who distilled her insights from the book um, as they pertain to the work of the church in relation to prison. And so I think there is that suggests to me there is the potential for people for in that audience to find the book useful. One
mm,
of the things that is a major theme for me that might be relevant there is that I think Paul himself is the object of the support and care of the Philippian believers that he writes to. That
mhm,
is, he's not an elevated apostle who writes selflessly and without need of his own, but he writes from a vulnerable position,
mhm,
and um, the Philippian believers respond. In many ways, Philippians is a thank you letter written in response to the gift that the Philippians send to Paul through Epaphroditus.
mhm,
And this attests, to my mind, to a kind of uh, I might say, like, theologically in relation to prison ministry, if you will, it suggests something about a kind of mutuality, that there's a giving and receiving happening in both directions, and that
mm,
it is not just, if people working inside prison contexts think of themselves analogously to Paul, they are not the only ones who are bringing anything of value. Um,
mm.
but the gifting goes in both directions in that letter, and I think in any kind of prison ministry context as well.
Yeah. That's helpful. Yeah, because when I was reading, I was definitely thinking of certain former students who I know are prison chaplains who I think it's like, oh, I feel like they would appreciate certain parts of this, or maybe the book as a whole. So I have yet to send an email to them to suggest they read it, but I think I may do so. Send them a copy of this link, and hopefully they'll get a sense this will be worth their while.
Great.
No, that's helpful. Yeah, yeah, because it's what because I think even going back to kind of that question of Momsen, I think what it's sort of the experience of prisons in the US is, I think, not just qualitatively different, but I would also say like quantitatively different from antiquity as well, right? Kind of
Of
in that
course.
US context, it is just a much more, we know many more people who are in prison in various sorts, or the sheer number of people at mass incarceration that you mentioned. Um, so even if Momsen is kind of significantly overstating the lack of prison experience in antiquity, there still is that difference in a way that I think it's helpful for us now to notice things that, especially in the U.S., where there's what more prisoners than anywhere else in the world, right?
Hmm.
At this point, I don't know that a question there. I think I was just kind of tying certain threads together in my mind out loud there.
Yeah.
Um, so, um, another question for people who haven't read the book, because I think some of my own work relates to the Roman military in the New Testament, and Um, I think kind of like prisons, they're both something that I think people often assume they know a lot about, but what they're doing is just assuming that the Jesus movies they've watched on TV are historically accurate.
Hmm.
Or,
Hmm.
movies about Paul or what have you,
Hmm.
or whatever gaps they're filling in, that these are kind of, like kind of filling in the gaps in some ways that unintentionally, or just assuming that what they've heard is true. But what would you, just for people who haven't read it, what are some things that you think people might be most surprised about the experience of prison, or specifically Paul's experience of prison, that they would either encounter through reading your book or just things that just sort of, you know, Momsen kind of famously, I can't remember if Momsen was the one who used the holding tank phrase or not. Was he the one who, or I guess maybe his translators, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's a distillation of his approach, at least, even if he didn't use the
Yeah.
phrase.
Yeah, maybe.
Um,
Yeah. So there's, okay, go ahead. So I'll let you kind of see where I'm going with all this anyway, I think.
yeah, no, I think one of the surprises is that it how significant a place prison held in people's imagination. That is, even if the experience is not as common as it is, say, in the United States today, um, uh, nevertheless, people dreamt about prison.
Yeah.
It's a common thing in Artemidorus's dream interpretation manual. The dreams about being incarcerated or dreams that might symbolize that one was about to be incarcerated show up.
Mhm.
Um, it is it uh, shows up in association regulations, so that some associations have rules that if one of their association members ends up imprisoned, whether justly or unjustly, they'll provide food,
Mhm.
etc., for and funds for legal defense. So it's a common enough part of the ancient world that it shapes people's imagination and shapes the way that people imagine the authority of the magistrate. Um, the authority of the magistrate might be for the elite. It might consist largely of economic penalties, but for most of the people in the Roman world, it was experienced concretely in what the magistrate could do um, to your body, whether whip you or incarcerate you.
Mhm.
So it's a fairly major part of people's imagination. And that's why, again, I'll quote from Matthew Larson, but he speaks of the Roman world as a carceral world, even
Mhm.
if not that many people are imprisoned compared to, again, compared to the United States today, because of the way it shaped people's imagination. One of the other things that I think would be a surprise for most, as far as the modern imagination of the prison would go, is just how porous prisons are. That is, how many people are going in and out of the prison every day. Of prisons in the ancient world did not supply food for those who are incarcerated, or at least in some cases, prison rations are mentioned, but seem to be described as insufficient to sustain life. So that means people are dependent on the provisions of friends and neighbors, as Paul is dependent on the provision of the Philippians. And to make that happen, guards have to let people in and they have to let people out. They have to, let people in to go and bring in these things. So there are visitors coming in and out of the prison all the time. And prisoners themselves, there's some texts that talk about prisoners who um, go out for the day, sometimes to beg and more often to work,
Mhm.
forced labor. And so prison is not, and prisons are located centrally in the cities that in their cities. They're not on the outskirts of town or in rural areas as people in the United States have come to expect, which makes prison a much more visible and obvious part of social life.
Yeah, that's pretty helpful, especially kind of the relevance to Paul, especially Philippians, is you kind of laid it out right there, right? Kind of if these are these sort of what, as you use the phrase, kind of porous buildings or whatever that people are moving in and out, and kind of that support is necessary. I think it does a lot to help make sense of these things.
Right, and
Um,
how Paul can talk about the brothers who are here with me, not necessarily imprisoned with him, but
mhm.
people who are in his orbit even while he's incarcerated. He's obviously has access to Epaphroditus.
Mm,
Um, he has access to someone who is drafting the letter on his behalf, a
yeah.
secretary or whatever. There are people who are in his domain despite the fact that he's incarcerated. Um, which is again harder for those of us who think of maximum security prisons in some rural area hundreds of miles from everyone else to imagine.
Yeah, and in the States too, where, if someone's calling from prison, they're charged $5 a minute and things like that, right? Not that writing an antiquity is exactly inexpensive, but it's, that communication is very different between outside and inside, I think is one of the things that you're pointing to as well.
Right,
Um,
which me I mean is kind of, maybe I would say, a moral observation in relation to that, is that yes, it's easy to characterize ancient prisons as extremely harsh in comparison with modern prisons, and certainly the physical conditions, torture,
mhm,
darkness, filth, everything is uh, many things that would not be would not be tolerated in an American prison context.
Hmm.
But there is, in fact, nothing like this social alienation, at least very uncommonly. Would there be anything like this social alienation or exclusion that is part of the American system, and particularly something like solitary confinement?
Right.
Certainly, there's shame, there's stigma associated with being incarcerated in the ancient world, but one is not separated to the same extent from one's fellow human beings.
Well, maybe I could ask you a question on that note then. So if it's not separation then and that kind of isolation that you're noting, abjection is, in the title of the book itself, what do you see as being kind of those, or how do you see prison as a place that's perhaps generating abjection, or causing this sort of, what's making it so miserable then? Or what's Paul responding to perhaps when he's very willfully being a joyful figure is kind of one of the takeaways I'm getting from your book there.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think uh, some centuries after Paul, John Chrysostom writes that what prisons are for is placing one's opponent underfoot. The idea of being under somebody's, like literally under somebody's foot, is
Hmm.
how he would describe that. Um, and so that's really about social position, and it's about
Hmm.
social position as concretized in who controls which bodies. It's very concrete,
Hmm.
that bodies are abject. They have stigma and shame, not abstractly as some, you know as some idea, but they are abject because they are being crushed, they are being whipped, they're being opened up to bleed,
Hmm.
they're being confined in a way that dramatizes the power of the one who is confining them and the weakness and incapacity of the one being confined. And that way it's very primal, kind of raw expression of mastery on the one hand and then abjection on the other hand.
Hmm.
It does, in fact, if you're thinking about Foucault, it looks an awful lot like what Foucault said torture was about, which was to
Right.
write the power of the magistrate on the body of the one who's being punished.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think this is largely what abjection is about in ancient prisons and in Paul. And this is where Paul ends up mapping his experience of abjection onto the crucifixion of Christ. He talks in Philippians 3:21, talks about sharing about the body of our humiliation
Hmm.
being transformed into the body of Christ's glory, and imagines himself somehow as a reenactment of Christ's dying body, with the hope then that he will experience also that he will get to be a reenactment of Christ's glorious body
Right.
subsequently. And those for him that's again one of my points is that for him is not just a theological idea, but it's something he knows and feels in his body. It's grounded in his own experience, both of abjection and then of little tastes of glory in those ecstatic moments that he describes with the term Holy Spirit.
Yeah, well, that actually reminds me of one other thing I like. I can't remember one of the chapters you kind of where you're looking at that particular idea. Um, you do this in some ways we as we talked about earlier, pushing back against a certain way of kind of using Acts to simply slotting the epistles into Acts. But then I really like the chapter where you're showing that how Paul kind of develops as a thinker in his own way, right? That Paul's theology or eschatology, I think is kind of what you're, or I don't know if eschatology, but kind of is what he's saying about the afterlife anyway, what happens after death, um, changes from letter to letter. At least you've noted distinction there
Hmm.
between what he says in First Thessalonians and what he's saying in Philippians there. And it's, I think, helpful. I like that a lot. And I think you make a very persuasive case with that. Um, it also kind of shows how, um, what the sort of what how important it is to not flatten Paul's letters and to account for kind of his own changing life experience plays such a large role with that, right? So kind of you kind of just named quite well out loud how his experience of prisons leading him to kind of articulate his own kind of theology of who Jesus is, and Jesus' glorification and experiences and so on. Um, but he kind of this is his life, right? Like, and we see his thinking change. There's what he says in First Thessalonians about what happens after you die is different from what he seems to presume happens anyway. When he's talking about in Philippians, there, um, I don't know. I thought it was. I don't know that a specific question with that, but I think it's something that I found really compelling in the book. I don't know. Is there anything that you wanted to say about that? You kind of looks like you might.
Yeah, I know. I mean, for me, I think it's important too to think of Paul, the coherence of Paul's letters, again, not being abstract,
Hmm.
but being experiential, um, or or at least rooted in his body and in the life of that body, not
Hmm.
rooted in. He's not sitting around playing with ideas, although certainly ideas help him make sense of what is happening in his body. Um, but the modern Western academic tradition in which Paul is usually read has a search for a kind of coherence at the level of
Yeah.
theological abstraction that sometimes I think is just it leads us to ask questions um, that are not the same kinds of questions Paul is asking. He's
Hmm.
not looking for that kind of abstract coherence. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that Paul's we see a different assumptions about what happens after death in First Thessalonians than we do in Philippians. That seems to me to be very clear, and I would actually push back against the idea that that's a kind of theological development.
Okay.
It's not so much that Paul is developing from one thing to another, than that in different circumstances
Mm.
there are different ideas that or different formulations, different imaginings that rise to the surface.
Sure, and just become more compelling in one context, and may or may not last, or may become more not may significant for a while, but maybe less significant in another context.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, in that way, it's a question about the salience of particular theological ideas at different moments in Paul's life.
Yeah, it's helpful. I think we're getting close to wrapping up here, so maybe I kind of just maybe ask some just a broad question. Congratulations on the book. Fantastic. I would encourage everyone to go out and buy it. Won the Frank W. Beer Award at CSBS. I think the reviews I've seen it have been very positive. I can tell you the review in Bible and Critical Theory that I wrote is going to be very positive. But what projects are coming up for you? I know you. Well, I know you just published a co-edited volume. If you want to mention that, I think a pretty monumental one as well. But what's coming up for you? What else are you working on at the moment? What else has come out recently? If people want to,
Sure. Yeah,
yeah.
no, the fairly major piece that came out recently is a volume I edited together with Heidi Wendt,
Mhm.
who I've been working with for quite a while. Her and I um, co-conspired to create the historical Paul section at the Society of Biblical Literature. And so the volume is called the T&T Clark Handbook to the Historical Paul. So it's 25 chapters on the biography of Paul written by leading scholars from all over the world on various topics of interest to people who are interested in Paul.
It's like how many
Um,
pages? It's pretty massive, isn't it?
it is. I
We
actually
have
don't
the
have. I
content
forget
for
the
it.
page count, but it's uh, it's certainly longer than Abject Joy is.
Yeah.
And probably less likely to be read in one sitting or
Sure.
from
Yeah.
or from front to back all at once. But I'm excited that that volume is out there in the world.
Mm.
What I'm thinking about currently is following up on the work around the history of emotion that Abject Joy got me into. The more that I reflect on it, the more I see the importance of emotion for writing the history of earliest Christianity.
Mm.
I think as you mentioned, it's becoming a fairly uh, popular topic. That is, there's a fair amount of work being done on. There's some on emotion in Paul's letters, a number of exegetical studies on various emotions. There's quite a bit of work in engaging with affect theory, which we spoke about earlier. To my mind, what hasn't been done yet is to show how emotion matters to the broader history of earliest Christianity. That is, apart from interpreting specific texts, what difference does it make to the way we tell the story of the earliest Christ
Mm.
groups if we take emotion one of the analogies that I've been playing with is if we take emotion not just as the foam on the wave, the momentum is somewhere else, and there's this bubbling up of emotion that kind of
Mm.
accompanies that, which I think is how historians tend to take it. But actually, in some ways, emotion is the flesh on the bones of the early Christ groups. It's central to what makes them live and move and have their being, if I can channel Acts for just one moment. So, um, so that's the question I want to ask. Still feels like early stages in that project. Colleen Shantz and I are going to be co-presenting a paper on baptism and its affective resonance at the SBL this November. So that's sort of a
Right.
early taste of some of the work that I'm doing in that regard.
Very cool. Well, that sounds like an exciting project. Yeah, I would say one thing I know my own interest that I really appreciate about Abject Joy is that you have this sort of interest in social history in a way that I think resonates with at least, certainly there's been work done on affect or in emotion and biblical studies, as you know, kind of often, not always, I'm not saying this in a dismissive way, but often kind of related to specific passages. But I think I really appreciate the social historical approach to it that I think was really um, not necessarily the primary method throughout or anything, but it was a way of approach that I think kind of might make it an easier entry point for people who might find affect or history of emotion something intimidating. I think that social historical approach can um, might be help a bitter pill go down, a good pill to go down, but a bitter one nonetheless. If it's something you're finding intimidating, I think it's a very good point of entry into a discussion of affect and emotion. I think for those who are a little intimidated by it. So
Sure,
yeah.
and my approach to emotion is in some ways it's social historical in its orientation. That is,
Mhm.
again, I think emotion is deeply embedded in cultural life. It shapes cultural life and is shaped by cultural life, and so I think a, I'm more and more convinced that rich social history should be addressing emotion at every stage.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. So we'll wrap it up here. So I want to thank everyone for watching the video and want to remind you to check out Herbs and Polis online, social media of various sorts. It's Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, etc. Many ways to stream or to share this. And to thank you, Ryan, for stopping by and joining us today for a conversation that I feel like I learned, even after having read it, learned a few good things from you along the way here and would absolutely encourage people to check this out. Abject Joy came out, I want to say 2021,
Yep,
Oxford University Press, um, award winning already, been out for maybe roughly a year now, I think,
just about.
and
Yep.
just about a year and already winning awards and getting rave reviews. So please do check it out. Request your library get it, something like that if you can't get it yourself. So thank you very much, Ryan, and wishing everyone a wonderful day.
Thank you, Chris.